In this CineGuru MAX tutorial, we're going to take a look at Cine-trigger zones and how they work. Now, we've used them quite a lot in our other tutorials to trigger off various elements, but we've never actually taken a look at the Cine-trigger zone itself and how it can be used. So here is a straightforward scene where we've got a camera. When it's triggered, it's going to go from point A to point B, and it's going to be looking at this focal point the whole time. We've also got a light marker attached to a spotlight, and these can also be triggered using Cine-trigger zones. And we've got an actor who, when triggered, again using a Cine-trigger zone, is going to walk to a mark, and then he's going to look up at this mark over here. If you want to know how to set any of this stuff up, I recommend watching our other tutorials first. But let's take a look at the Cine-trigger zone that's actually going to fire everything off. So like any zone in CineGuru MAX, Cine-trigger zones can be manipulated. You can change their shape, you can kind of add and remove points, and you can make them bigger, smaller, scale them to whatever sort of size you need them to be. And the idea behind a Cine-trigger zone is it's an area of the level where if the player enters, it will trigger certain elements. So, for example, we could just trigger a camera. So if we go into our visual logic connections and we draw a connection between our Cine-trigger zone and our camera, now if the player enters the zone, it will trigger a little camera move around this bike. So all pretty straightforward. But there are a couple of parameters you can tweak with Cine-trigger zones. So the first one is D time. D time is a delay. So by default this is 100 milliseconds, which is imperceptible really, but you can make this bigger if you want. So that means that when the player enters the zone, the camera won't trigger straight away. So if you set it to, let's say, 3, there'd be a little 3-second delay before the camera triggers. We've also got these two checkboxes. So the first one, enable skip, is ticked by default. What enable skip does is if the player holds spacebar during a CineGuru cinematic, it will abort that cinematic. So I held that held spacebar for more than a quarter of a second, and you can see it kind of returned me back to my original position and gave control back to the player. So you can do that at any point, and what it means is that that cinematic then can't be reactivated. You only get to activate it once, and when it's been aborted it can't be reactivated. And aborting also works for actors, and we covered that in a previous tutorial. You've also got this checkbox down here which is disable if combat. Now this one is a bit sketchy, doesn't always work, but the idea behind it is if it's checked, if you're in a kind of a combat situation with a character, it won't allow you to trigger the cinematic, because CineGuru characters will come after the player character during combat situations. So it doesn't always work, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. I'm sure that now I'm trying to demonstrate it, it probably won't work, but if I got into this situation here, then tried to enter the zone, you can see it actually didn't trigger the camera that time. Is he going to shoot me again, or is that it? Yeah, see, now that time, because there was a long enough gap between him shooting me and not shooting me, I was allowed to trigger the cinematic. So, as I say, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's a little bit sketchy, but can be worth playing with. You can also use Cine-trigger zones to trigger light markers. So as we looked at in a previous tutorial, if you draw a visual logic connection between your Cine-trigger zone and your light marker, when you go into the zone, now it's going to trigger our spotlight. And you can also trigger multiple light markers from the same Cine-trigger zone. So if we had several of these lights, we can draw connections between each of them, and a single zone can trigger multiple lights at once. And as we've also already seen, you can also use Cine-trigger zones to trigger actors. So you just need to trigger one actor that's referenced within an action text. If your action text contains instructions for multiple actors, all of those actors will be triggered once one of them is triggered. In this case, it's a pretty straightforward action text. Our character literally just walks over to his mark, and then he looks up at the sky, at a mark up here somewhere. And what's nice about Cine-trigger zones is that you can also connect multiple elements together. So we're triggering our actor at the moment, but let's also trigger our light marker, and let's also trigger our cinematic, our camera. So now, if I've connected everything up correctly, when we enter the zone, spotlight comes on, actor comes over. Actually, because of the way the camera is, you can't actually see that he's looking up, but you do get the idea. So we are triggering multiple elements from one zone. So that's really useful, but sometimes you're not going to want to trigger cinematics or sequences just off of where the player is within the level. Sometimes you want it to be a little bit more interactive. You want perhaps throwing a switch to trigger a cinematic, or maybe collecting an object. And to do that, we're going to look at Cine-trigger entities in the next tutorial. So I'll see you then.